You know that feeling? The one where you're just staring at a stack of articles or PDFs, maybe even like game rule books,
Oh, yeah.
and you know there's something really brilliant buried inside, but it feels like you need a map, maybe a shovel, just to find the core of it.
Definitely. You just want someone to cut through the noise, pull out the actual
The-
signal.
exactly, and tell you what actually matters. Well, that's precisely what happened when we got this stack of documents, rule books, quick starts, even a specific game module for something called Soul Hack.
Right. And looking through them, you get this hint of cyberpunk, sure, but it's not the usual kind. It feels different, more internal.
Yeah, recursive, maybe?
Yeah.
It immediately signaled that this wasn't really about, breaking into systems.
No, it felt more like it was about systems that kind of invite you in and then change you fundamentally once you're there.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack what Soul Hack actually is, how it works, and what makes it feel so different from, well, standard expectations.
We want to pull out those core insights for you, show you the mechanics that aren't just rules, but are the message.
Yeah, exploring the signal, not just listing features off a page.
Okay, so digging into these sources, what is Soul Hack at its heart? What defines it?
Well, right away, the sources are pretty clear. They label it as an RPG focused on psychological transformation, recursive identity, memory collapse.
And they're very upfront about what it isn't, which is just as important.
Totally. It's explicitly not a hacking simulator, not about tactical infiltration missions. And it's definitely not just cyberpunk as, Chrome and cool gear.
The language they use is really key here, I think. They call it a ritual operating system, a codex for metaphorical intrusion. Even the game itself is described as a hacking ritual disguised as poetic recursion.
That tells you straight up, this isn't about GUIs and firewalls in the traditional sense.
No.
And here's a core difference that really jumped out. Instead of the player trying to force their way into a system,
Right.
the system, which they call the zone, it kind of welcomes you. Politely, they say. Beautifully. Irreversibly.
That shift is huge. From force to invitation. From resistance to welcome. It swaps out a lot of traditional RPG mechanics.
Yeah, it uses this transaction-based narrative engine. Initiative isn't about who goes first, it's about who gets invited to transact.
And power isn't measured in stats like strength or dexterity. It's about symbolic weight. You're not boosting skills. You're engaging in what they call semantic recursion.
And you're not moving through physical space like a building layout. Your movement is through metaphor.
Which brings us to the core setting concept. The zone.
Yes, the zone. A crucial concept. It's not a location. Right?
Not at all. It's described as a skin stretched over the real-world hack. So think about a data breach or corporate espionage or maybe even a psychological breakdown.
Yeah.
The zone isn't the physical office or the server room. It's the metaphorical layer that overlays that event.
So things you might recognize, like firewalls or maybe security demons, they show up in the zone, but as allegorical areas.
Yeah, the sources give examples like a crystal orchard or chanting choirs. Really evocative stuff.
And if you fail authentication, like a password fails or a key gets corrupted, that failure isn't just, oops, try again. It becomes a mutation.
It grafts itself onto your identity.
Wow, and they say the zone applies to anything you wish to haunt. That phrase alone just sticks with you.
It really does.
Yeah.
So if the zone is metaphor and movement is through these abstract areas, how does the game actually structure that experience for the players?
Okay, the structure is called a cycle, and they frame it as a spiral of identity and distortion.
Spiral, okay.
Yeah. So a cycle moves you through several of these metaphorical areas, maybe 3 to 5. And as you go, as you interact, you accumulate things called burden and instability.
Like,
You encounter mutations, you deal with feedback loops from the zone itself, and then the whole cycle wraps up with an aftershock.
and who are you in this spiral?
You're an operator, and your character, your identity, it isn't built with skill points or classes in the usual way. It's built with a triad.
A triad.
Yeah, 3 core aspects. They're defined by what you bring into the zone, what you fear losing while you're there, and why you entered in the first place.
Ah, okay, so it's very narrative focused right from character creation.
Exactly. The sources give some great examples. Like, an operator might bring a sealed secret, maybe fear losing the shape of your name, and perhaps entered to find someone who never returned.
Or maybe you bring a mirror that only shows regrets. Fear losing a memory of someone who might not have existed, and entered to escape a self you can no longer sustain. Really potent hooks.
Totally. And your starting resources reflect this focus too. You begin with one secret, one item, and one question.
Not weapons or gear.
No, these are symbolic representations directly tied to your triad. A secret might be, I watched someone vanish. An item could be that mirror that only shows regrets, described as unstable in the zone. And a question might be, what did I leave behind to become this?
These starting resources sound crucial because you mentioned interacting isn't about typical actions. It's about transactions.
Yes, exactly. Every time you try to engage with the zone, every attempt to do something, it's framed as a metaphysical exchange.
You don't act on the zone, you transact with it.
Right. You're trading, gaining, transforming, or maybe even fracturing parts of yourself, parts of your symbolic resources.
And the types of transactions emphasize this. Give, gain, transform, fracture. You might surrender a secret, gain an item, transform an item into a secret, or fracture something. Glitch it out.
Yeah, and the key insight there is that action always costs something. And that cost is always personal transformation or, distortion. There's usually a limit too, like one transaction per area, per character, typically.
And the sources really stress that flavor is everything when you declare what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. You describe the metaphysical exchange first. How are you giving that secret? What does it mean to transform that item? That description then helps determine its narrative weight.
Narrative weight. Okay, how does that work?
It's basically how much it matters to your operator. Is this action trivial, +1 to your role, deeply personal, no modifier? Or is it soulbound, -1, tied right to your core identity, your triad?
And that weight modifies the role.
Yeah, the resolution mechanic itself is pretty streamlined. It's just 1d6 plus that modifier. No complex dice pools.
Simple roll, but the outcomes sound deeply narrative.
Totally. A 4 or 5 is success. A 6+ is success with a twist, maybe some insight or a bonus. But the lower results are interesting. 2-3 means the zone resists, you get unintended consequences.
And a natural one.
That's a burden spike.
Yeah.
You fail and you gain +2 burden, that psychic load we mentioned. It's a critical failure with a heavy thematic cost.
That burden spike is a perfect example of mechanics embodying theme. Mechanical failure equals direct psychic weight.
Exactly. And fracturing a resource, choosing to glitch it, that's particularly volatile.
That's so sure.
Well, when you try to fracture something, you roll a d6. On different results, it might spread instability to others nearby, become a volatile glitch artifact you can use later, but at great risk. Or it might even just rewrite itself, change its nature entirely.
And those fractured resources, they stick around.
Yeah, they keep weighing on you. They add +1 burden whenever you try to use them again, and they have a 50% chance of just backfiring completely. Using glitched things is risky.
The sources also mentioned something about using terms from a landfill lexicon in transactions.
Oh, right. The lexicon is fantastic. It's described as this glossary of glitch, dream fragments, zone-corrupted terms. It's the zone's own language, its vocabulary of metaphor and static.
So you can use these terms.
Yeah, you can invoke one of these terms like lacrimae or obscura to flavor your transaction. If it really deepens the narrative weight, the GM might give you a +1 bonus on the roll.
But there's a cost, I assume.
Always a cost. Using a lexicon term like that makes the term drifted for the rest of that cycle. It's unusable for anyone, so it's a temporary boost, but you're sort of contaminating the zone's language for yourselves temporarily.
Okay, so as you're making these transactions, using lexicon terms, maybe fracturing things, the spiral deepens. You mentioned burden and instability accruing.
Right. Burden is framed as your psychic load, the weight of memory, grief, contradiction. Most transactions add +1 burden, and those critical failures, the burden spikes, add +2.
And this burden mechanically tracks your psychological state, doesn't it? It's not just flavor text.
No, definitely not. As your burden climbs, you hit these soft mutation thresholds. Maybe at 4 burden, you start showing pre-mutation symptoms, like sensory glitches, odd feelings.
Okay.
Then maybe at 7 burden, those symptoms might worsen. At levels like 5 and 8, a mutation you've experienced might lock in, becoming persistent, part of who you are now.
And if it gets too high, say 10 burden.
You don't die, not usually. You trigger an exit state. The sources have this beautiful, chilling phrase for it. The zone is weighing you down until you collapse into meaning.
Collapse into meaning. Wow. Okay, so that's burden. What about instability? You said that's different.
Yeah, instability is more like short-term volatility, how close you are to psychic rupture right now. It can go up if you, say, delay or refuse a transaction when prompted, or if a player fractures a resource, or if the zone itself reacts with feedback.
We got a range, right? 0 to 3.
Exactly. And if you hit instability 3, things get dicey. Before you can even act, you have to roll 1d6.
What happens?
On a 1-3, you trigger a glitch mutation, immediate, potentially disruptive transformation. But on a 4-6, you manage to stabilize. You actually reduce your instability by 1 and your burden by 1. So it's a moment of potential crisis or potential relief.
And instability can spread.
Yeah, there's this idea of instability contagion. When someone hits instability 3, others nearby might have to roll. And on a bad roll, their instability goes up too. Psychic static spreading. There's even an optional rule, burden bleed, where you can intentionally take burden from someone else, but you gain instability and form a psychic link. Risky.
This all feeds directly into mutations, which sound absolutely central to the whole transformation theme.
Oh, completely. Mutations are how the zone actively rewrites you, according to the sources.
And they're not just, like, physical changes,
Yeah.
tentacles or whatever.
No, much broader. They can be sensory shifts, maybe colors sound wrong, behavioral compulsions you have to hum constantly or trace patterns. They can even twist your core triad. What you fear losing might change, or why you entered becomes corrupted, or that item you started with might become some kind of echo artifact.
So they can be minor and temporary or major and disruptive.
Exactly. And some can become persistent, carrying over into future cycles, maybe even defining a new role for your character.
And those glitch mutations from hitting instability 3.
Right. Those are triggered by that instability roll. They cause an immediate narrative transformation. Your instability drops back to 0 because the tension broke, but your burden usually rises by 1, unless you stabilized instead.
What's really interesting is you mentioned players can choose to glitch.
Yeah, voluntarily. At pretty much any point, a player can just say, I'm glitching.
Yeah.
They choose to take a mutation, they gain +1 instability, but they might unlock some kind of bonus effect, maybe reroll dice, gain a resource, something like that.
So it's an active choice. Embracing transformation, even negative transformation, for a potential advantage. That's fascinating.
It really is. And mutations don't just vanish at the end of a cycle. They might become ambient effects in the zone, evolve into zone feedback, or even pass to another player.
But you can keep one?
Yeah, you get to choose one mutation to carry forward, weaving that change into your operator's ongoing story.
So it's not just the players changing and mutating. You mentioned the zone itself reacts through zone feedback.
Right. Zone feedback is described as the zone, basically. Learning. It evolves based on what the players do. It rewrites its own rules because you showed it how.
So it's not a static environment at all. It's adapting.
Adapting, yeah. And it acts as a global condition, something that reshapes the rules of engagement for everyone. The sources say it can be adaptive, predatory, occasionally even merciful, surprisingly.
How does that work mechanically? Does it just happen?
Usually only one feedback rule is active at a time, unless something really chaotic happens. But after, say, 3 transactions have occurred in an area, the GM rolls 1d6. On a 1-3, a new feedback rule emerges, maybe based on recent events. On a 4-6, the current rule might persist or even intensify.
Can you give some examples of these rules?
Sure, the sources list things like, all names are now treated as secrets. Suddenly, using your own or someone else's name has the weight and risk of revealing a secret. Or maybe, questions now cost +1 burden to transform, or glitch artifacts backfire 75% of the time. Even something like speaking aloud triggers a transaction. That would completely change how players communicate.
That makes the zone feel incredibly alive. Watching, reacting, maybe even misinterpreting your actions.
Exactly. There's even an optional rule called feedback memory, where the GM can choose to bring back an old feedback rule, but it costs everyone +1 burden, like dredging up the zone's past trauma.
And you track these rules.
Yeah, you log them in an archive log. It becomes this history of the zone's own changes, a record of how your presence and actions have taught it new ways to be hostile or strange or whatever it becomes.
Okay, so this constant pressure, the burden, the feedback, it all leads towards that point you mentioned earlier where burden hits its maximum, the exit state.
Right. And reaching burden 10 isn't typically character death. The sources call it integration.
Integration, not elimination.
Exactly. The zone doesn't just delete you, it edits you out. Your exit state defines what aspect of you gets left behind, how the zone kind of assimilates your identity and how the game itself shifts for the players still in there.
So what are some of these exit states? What happens?
They're really evocative. You might be subsumed, maybe you become a permanent zone protocol, manifesting as a new persistent feedback rule for everyone else.
Well, you become part of the system.
Or you could be forgotten, literally erased from the other player's memories. Maybe the GM has another player delete one element of their triad, representing the gap you left.
Ouch.
You might fragment, your sense of self splits apart, leaving some of your resources secrets, items behind for others to find, or perhaps you're reflected, and a sort of mirror image of your character enters the zone as an NPC, maybe hostile, maybe confused.
Is there any way to actually leave?
Yes, there's returned. You managed to exit the zone, but you're fundamentally changed. You might rejoin the game next session, but as a new role, defined by one of your final persistent mutations. There's also an optional rule called Zone Keeps the Receipt, which implies some cost or lingering connection even if you return.
And even after you exit, the zone keeps a piece of you. Echo effects.
Yeah, echo effects are these lingering distortions. Your departure leaves a mark.
Like what?
Maybe a glitched item you carried is later found by another player, or a secret you held mutates into an unfinished question embedded in the zone's fabric. A feedback rule might twist itself to reflect your final mutation, or a lexicon term you used often becomes contaminated, adding instability when others try to use it.
So your presence continues to affect the zone even after you're gone.
Exactly. Maybe a transaction fails unexpectedly because of a residual identity conflict from you. Or, from an example table, your name might become forbidden to speak aloud within the zone. It's a fascinating way to handle character departure integration and influence, not just removal.
It really emphasizes that nothing is truly lost, just transformed, recontextualized by the zone.
And players who exit aren't necessarily gone forever either. The rules mention re-entry protocols. Exited players might be able to rejoin later as something else, like glitch-born echoes or zone constructs.
Okay, so the core loop involves moving through these cycles, dealing with transactions, burden, mutations, feedback, and potentially exiting, all within these metaphorical areas.
Right, and it's worth circling back to those areas because they're not just settings.
They're states of being, right? Recursive emotional architectures.
Exactly. Each area isn't just a room description. It has a specific tone, like brittle, resonant, crowded. It has a surreal prompt that pushes the players emotionally or thematically. Often it requires a specific type of transaction to progress.
And it provides hooks for mutations and potential zone feedback triggers.
Spot on. The examples really bring it home. We mentioned the glass orchard. Maybe its tone is refracting. The prompt is what memory shatters when you look closely. And the required transaction is to give a secret related to that memory.
Or the choir of unspoken names. Tone, suppressed, prompt, whose voice joins the choir when you remain silent. Requirement. Gain a question by offering a name, maybe one from your triad.
Yeah. And they even have area subtypes mentioned, like forked areas that present choices, null zones where interaction might be impossible, choruses areas where multiple players might act together, or viral areas that infect the next area you enter. Adds layers of complexity.
And these areas are where that landfill lexicon really comes alive, weaving into the descriptions and prompts.
Definitely. The lexicon, that glossary of glitch, dream fragments, and zone-corrupted terms, it's the very language the zone speaks.
In the language the operatives encounter, speak, and sometimes through mutation become.
Exactly. It's used constantly to build atmosphere, flavor the area descriptions, inspire the prompts, and even directly hook into mechanic.
Because the entries aren't just definitions, they have mechanical hooks.
Right. That's key. Take lacrimae, these tear-shaped emotion fragments. The mechanical hook might say encountering them spawns +1 instability unless you can specifically name the emotion embedded within it.
Or obfuscara, a cloud of distorted meaning. Its hook might let you fracture it into a glitch artifact, like weaponized confusion.
Or syllable scar, a wound from speaking a forbidden word. That could manifest as a behavioral mutation, causing you to pause or gain instability when you try to speak certain concepts.
Name drift. The erosion of a name.
Could be a triad mutation, changing what you fear losing to the shape of my name. Or Ashen Query, a question literally burned into the zone's fabric. Its hook might be that it replaces your current question, adds burden, and you must answer it somehow or gain instability each area until you do.
So these terms aren't just flavor text. They are active components of the system's code, capable of rewriting you or the zone itself. They're like fundamental units of metaphorical meaning.
Perfectly put. They're the building blocks of the zone's reality.
Okay, so we have this incredibly rich, but also quite abstract system. How does it actually look when applied to a specific scenario? The sources included that module, right? Zone of overlook?
Yeah, Zone Overlook is a great concrete example. It shows how you can take the core SoulSack system and overlay it onto a specific theme, in this case, a haunted hotel.
But maintaining that metaphorical layer, I assume, it's not literally just exploring a spooky hotel.
Exactly. It's presented as a mythological compression protocol. The goal is to interpret hostile architecture, the hotel, which represents a psychosemantic firewall. The whole thing uses themes of grief, doubt, guilt.
And the target isn't a server, it's...
A human consciousness, designated Protocol 417, buried deep within this mnemonic index, structured like a hotel.
Okay, so how does it translate the core concepts, the hotel theme?
It's really clever. Instead of encountering abstract security like ICE, you encounter rooms, each with its own tone and prompt. Instead of being generic hackers or operatives, you are linguistic avatars, symbolic self-representations, or simply hotel guests.
And the characters.
Yeah.
The triads.
They give sample characters with hotel themes identities, like the Lost Reservation or the Ledger Whisperer. Your triad might involve bringing an unpaid bill, fearing losing your room key, and entering because you never checked out.
Mutations become hotel-themed.
Yep. Things like the bellhop loop, maybe a compulsion to knock 3 times on everything, or service smile, an inability to express negative emotion facially, wallpaper vision, seeing patterns move.
And the areas are rooms.
Right.
All right.
Like room 237, the module description says, of course it's 237. Its prompt might be about facing something dreadfully familiar behind a locked door and maybe requires you to transform a secret into a question to gain entry, or the bar where everyone knows your name, but it's wrong. The carpet echoes.
The core mechanics are all still there, just seen through this hotel lens.
Exactly. Transactions, burden, instability, feedback, it all works the same. The exit states are reskinned as checkout procedures.
Checkout procedures.
Yeah.
Like,
You might join the staff, becoming part of the hotel's mechanism, similar to being subsumed. You could occupy a room, becoming a permanent fixture, like being fragmented. Or you might check out as someone else's, similar to returning, but perhaps with a more altered identity.
and the landfill lexicon gets a hotel makeover too.
Yeah, it becomes hotel vocabulary. Terms like stat concierge, room service shadow, wallpaper vein. They function just like lexicon terms, flavoring descriptions and having potential mechanical hooks tied to the hotel theme.
So the module really highlights the system's flexibility. It's the same engine, just running a different metaphorical program.
Precisely. It proves the core system isn't just about digital spaces. It's about processing identity, transformation, and intrusion through any rich symbolic system you choose.
Okay, moving beyond the game mechanics now. The sources included an afterword. That seemed to dig into the philosophy behind it all.
Yeah, the afterword is really important. It explicitly frames the game as an exploration of deeper ideas about identity, transformation, and resistance. It's not just an epilogue, it's kind of a statement of intent.
And the core idea there seemed to be becoming else.
That's the central theme they highlight. It's about transformation, yes, but specifically transformation without the usual goals. No heroism, no enlightenment, no neat conventional resolution.
It's about, as they put it, glitching for its own sake, choosing alteration without a destination.
Right. Without needing to be explained or made legible to the archive, it actively pushes back against common narrative structures.
Challenges that idea of closure as some kind of necessary comfort myth.
Exactly. It suggests change isn't always improvement, isn't always transcendence. And it hammers home that in this system, the goal isn't some external prize. The payload is you. You are what's being hacked, changed, processed.
The afterword connects this to real-world stuff too, right? Resisting societal pressures.
Yeah, it draws parallels, like resisting pressures to conform to certain aesthetic or social transformations. The example used is the aging gracefully complex. Or refusing to be neatly categorized and archived by systems, or rejecting ideals that might be built on exploitation.
So choosing transformation that doesn't have utility, that doesn't grant prestige or power in the conventional sense,
Yeah.
that's presented as a form of resistance.
Kind of like short-circuiting the logic of systems that demand you optimize yourself for their benefit.
It emphasizes resistance through alterity, through difference itself.
Yeah, being unsummonable, unroutable, unclaimed by any script. Survival, not as a definition in a handbook, but as signal degradation. Personal defense through disappearance. Ritual as resistance, but with no altar, no fixed point of control.
It's becoming other. becoming LS.
And just staying that way, not resolving back into something easily understood.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway here? Soul Hack clearly isn't just another game about hacking or even just psychological horror.
No, I think it's a system that uses this really potent aesthetic digital decay, metaphorical intrusion to explore incredibly rich and frankly unsettling ideas about identity, memory, and the sheer cost and nature of change itself.
And what really stands out is how tightly integrated the mechanics are with those themes. The rules for burden, instability, mutations, transactions, they aren't just rules. They are the engine driving that psychological transformation.
While playing the game is enacting the metaphor. There's very little separation.
Exactly. And the core idea is the zone as a flexible metaphor for any kind of overwhelming or transformative system. Identity is something fluid and transactable, this concept of transformation, without aiming for conventional resolution.
They're not just game concepts. They offer a really powerful, if maybe uncomfortable, framework for thinking about our own lives, right? How we interact with the systems, social, technological, psychological, that try to define us or change us.
It definitely makes you stop and consider what kind of change we seek or have imposed on us and why.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with builds on that becoming else idea from the afterword. In a world that constantly demands we transform into something legible, something optimized, something easily archived, what does it actually mean to simply glitch?
To become an else and just stay.